Right then, so the whole idea here is that a user will be filling out this form to sign up to the application. Now, Firebase Auth will be handling these two fields right here, the email and the password over here. So if a user types in an email that's already been used to create an account, for example, it's not unique, or if the password is not valid, or not long enough or something, then Firebase Auth will handle this verification. And it will send feedback to us when we make a request, such as this email has already been used, or this password is not long enough. However, it won't handle any kind of validation of this alias, because Firebase Auth isn't handling this or storing this data. We're taking this additional piece of data about our user and storing it in our Firestore database in a users collection separately. So we need to be the one to validate this and make sure it's unique, because I don't want two different people signing up with the same alias. But how do we do this? Well, when a user types in their details, we'll first of all take this alias that they enter. Then we'll speak to our Firestore database and ask it to look in our users collection to see if it can find a document with this alias. If it can't, then it means that that alias has not been taken yet, which is great. We can go ahead and create the user. If it finds that alias, then it means that this alias has already been taken, and we'll ask the user to provide a different one. Now, I want to make it clear that I think this logic is better placed inside a Firebase function using Cloud Functions on Firebase. But since we've not looked at those yet, and I don't really want to overwhelm you with everything at once, we'll run the logic in our Vue application for now, and then transfer it to a Cloud function in the next chapter when we do have a little look at Firebase functions. So for now, let's look at how we can tackle this problem in our Vue application. So let's head on over to the sign up component first of all. And initially, I'd like to check whether a user has in fact entered in a value into the alias field, because if they've not, then I can't really check in Firestore if that value exists. They need to enter something. So first of all, what we'll do is a quick check down here. We'll say if, and we want to check if this thing right here, this alias, is not null. So we'll say this dot alias. Because if this.alias is true, it means it has a value. So inside here, this is where we'll do that check with Firebase. Else, this will fire if they've not entered a value into that field. So what we need to do is provide them with some feedback. So let's do a comma and a feedback property and set this to null to begin with. What we'll do is set this.feedback equal to you must enter an alias. Okay, so now we want to give that feedback back to the user. So we'll output this feedback property up here just above this field. So a p tag, and it's going to have a class of red-text and also a class of center. So we can center it in the middle, and then we'll output the feedback right here. Now, we only want to output the feedback if it exists. So we'll say v-if and set that equal to feedback. So this will only show if feedback is not null. So we have that feedback now. In here, we want to perform that check. Now, when we talked about the data and how we're going to store our user data in our own Firestore database, what I said was instead of using those randomly generated IDs for each different record that Firebase creates, I'd like to instead take the slugified version of the alias and use that as the identifier, the ID of each individual record, right? So, therefore, what I'd like to do is take this alias that a user has entered. I want to turn it into a slugify it. Then I want to query the Firestore database to see if any other record exists which has that slug as its ID, because if it does, it means that this alias has already been taken. So then, we need to slugify this alias. So first of all, we need to install that. I've already done it. If I press Ctrl T, you can see I've run npm install slugify. So if you do the same and press --save if you've got an early version of npm, so it saves it to your dependencies, then we can use this package. First of all, we need to import it. So I'll say right here, import slugify from slugify, like so. Now we can use it down here. So let's slugify this alias first of all. We'll say this.slug, and we don't have that property yet, so let's create it. We'll create the slug property there and set it null to begin with. So we're going to store this slug value up here on the data, and we'll set this equal to slugify, which we just imported, and this is a function. The first parameter, remember, is what we want to slugify, and in this case it's the alias. So this.alias. The second parameter is an object, and it contains different options about how we want to slugify this alias. So firstly, I want the replacement to be a hyphen. So whenever there's a space, instead it's going to replace that with a hyphen. Then I want them to remove certain characters, and this is going to be a little bit of regex, and it just contains all of the characters that we want to remove right here globally. Okay, so it's removing those characters. We don't want those stored in the slug version of the alias. Okay, finally, we want this all to be lowercase, so we'll say lower is true. Okay, so that there is going to create the slug version of this alias. So for now, why don't we just console.log this out? So we'll say this.slug. All right, and we can test it. I'm going to right click and inspect over here and go to the console. And then if I type in an alias like the net in capitals ninja, press sign up, then we're going to get this slugified version of this thing right here. Cool. So this is what we'd be using as the document or record ID in our Firestore users collection. This would be the identifier of it instead of that randomly generated unique key that Firestore creates. Okay, so what I want to do is take this value we've just created, and I want to look inside a users collection on Firestore and check if this ID, this record, exists. Now, if it does exist, I'm going to come back and I'm going to say, sorry, you have to use a different alias. If it doesn't exist, then we're going to go ahead with the sign up. All right. So how do we check if this document actually exists? Well, first of all, what we need to do is import a reference to the database because we're going to use that now. So we'll say import db from, and we're going to import that from @firebase/init. All right then, so now we have that. We can come down here. After this slugify function, we'll say let ref equal db.collection, and it's the users collection we want to look in. And remember, we've not created this yet, but it doesn't matter. If it exists, it will look in it. Okay, so the users collection. Then I want to say find a doc. And we did this by passing in the ID of the doc right here. Now, I've just said we're going to be using these slugs as the ID. So I can pass in now this thing right here, this slug that we just created, to see if we can find a record that has that ID. So I'm going to pass in this dot slug, like so. So that's going to get a reference to this document right here in the users collection. Now, we want to know if that document actually exists. So what we'll do is we'll try to get it. We'll say ref.get. So remember, this is an asynchronous function. It's going to go out, it's going to go and try and get that document and return it to us. So what we can do is tack on a then method which fires a function when this is complete. So the callback function that it fires receives the doc as an argument, and we can do something with this doc. Now we want to see if it exists, and what we can do is use a property called .exists on this doc thing right here, which will return either true or false. True if it does, false if it doesn't. So we can simply say if doc.exists, like so, and if that is true, it means the document does exist. What we'll do for now is just say this.feedback and set it equal to this alias already exists, because now, because that exists, we want a user to pick a different alias. We don't want two different people with the same alias, right? That's if the document exists and this is true. Else, if it doesn't exist, if that's false, then this alias does not yet exist in the database, and therefore the user can use it. So I'll just say this.feedback and set that equal to this alias is free to use. Now obviously we're not going to say this ultimately because we'll just carry on with the sign up instead, but we will provide feedback like this if the document does exist and that alias has already been used. Alright then, so I'm going to save this now, and before I try this out, what I'd like to do is go into my database and set up the Firestore. So let's get started with the Cloud Firestore, and we'll start in test mode, press enable, and we should see our Firestore right here. We want to add a collection, and the collection name is going to be called users. All right, so now the document ID, this is the field that was auto-generated last time, okay? Now what I'd like to do is create one here called the-net-ninja. So I'm creating this manually to begin with. And I'll just create an alias property on it, and I'll set this to the net, ninja. All right, so this is what it would look like before it's been slugified, this after it's been slugified as the document ID. Now we don't need the other fields for now because we're not testing anything else out, we're just testing out this thing right here. So if we save that now, then we should see that appear in a second on the right hand side. Okay, so we have this document inside users, and the alias is the net ninja. So this thing right here, this ID, this is what we're checking, right? Over here, we're going out, we're getting the collection, users, and we're finding this document right here, this ID. Okay, we're passing the slug through, which is what a user types in, slugified, and we're trying to find that. Then if that document exists, we're going to provide some feedback saying they have to choose a new one. If it doesn't exist, then ultimately what we'll do is carry on with the sign up. But for now, we're just providing it with some feedback as well. So let's save that and let's test this out in a browser. So first of all, I want to just quickly refresh to make sure we catch any changes. Then I'm going to enter in an alias which I know doesn't exist, such as the Angular Avenger. Okay, so let's try that. Sign up. And we get a big error, but it says here this alias is free to use. Now I want to try this with the net ninja as well. So if I press sign up now, then we can see that I get the net ninja right there, and it says this alias already exists. Okay, so now we're going to tell the user to choose a different alias instead. So there we go. Now we're performing a little check here to make sure that the user's alias is in fact unique before we go ahead with the sign up. Like I said, later on we'll be using a cloud function to do this, but for now it's fine in this application. So just quickly back to this thing out here, we had a big error. Now the reason of this error is because Firestore is doing some API changes as I create these videos. Now this is just a little change to do with timestamps, and we can get rid of this big error by doing one little thing similar to this right here. We just need to edit our Firestore settings inside our Firestore initialization. So over here, what I'm going to do is come under where we define our Firebase app, and I'm going to paste in this line. So Firebase app.firestore.settings, and I'm passing in this object which has a property of timestamps in snapshots, and that's set to true. So that's just changing the way that Firebase can store new data types to do with timestamps. Okay, so press save. It's not really going to affect our app this, but it is going to get rid of this error message so that if we do this again now, the net ninja, and press sign up, then we're not going to get that big error.